Well, hello everyone, and happy Sunday to you. I don't know about how you've been finding lockdown. I kind of feel like it feels really monotonous, and yet time is going really, really quickly. It's like a really weird blend. I don't know if that's true for you. Maybe you're sat there wishing time to go faster. I don't know, but that's how I feel like Sunday's come around again really, really quickly. And I've been asked to talk about dealing with stress. And it's probably something that is quite topical at the moment, probably something we could all do with thinking about. But I'm interested in that we often say to each other, don't be stressed, or we're kind of fearful of stress. I'm so stressed at the moment. And it's interesting really because stress is a natural thing. Right? If you were supposed to be doing exams this summer, sorry to remind you that you're not anymore, you probably would have been stressed, not because you didn't revise enough, or that might be true, but because it's a natural thing to feel stress when we're under pressure. In fact, in any kind of situation where it is tough or we feel under threat, stress is a natural response. So our body's kind of fight or flight instinct. So to not have stress would actually be unnatural. And so stress is normal. The trouble is that often stress overwhelms us and causes us to react badly to situations, or at least we're not able to do what we need to do in a situation because we're overwhelmed with stress. And so rather thinking about how to get rid of stress, I want to think about how do we cope with stress? How do we use stress for our benefit? Because stress actually helps us to focus sometimes. If you've ever been in this situation, I haven't personally, but maybe you have, where you're being chased by a bear, okay? Stress is good, yeah? If you were chilled and calm, you'd probably be in trouble because you wouldn't have the adrenaline to run as fast, whereas stress makes you run faster and focuses the mind. And many of us will have been under an increased stress recently with the lockdown that's now being eased slowly. And it's like a societal kind of stress. And in that situation, it can feel even more overwhelming. And tasks that we normally would have done, or jobs that we have to do, or things like this can feel too difficult for us, or can feel overwhelming because there's this increase in stress. So I want to think about how do we manage that? How do we cope with that? Let me tell you a story of when stress got the better of me, which doesn't rarely happen. But this was when I did my driving test, okay? And it was a stressful situation because I had to pass first time. All right, I couldn't afford to have a retest. It was very expensive. And my parents had dragged me, kicking and screaming, from London, where I was born, all the way to the middle of nowhere in Norfolk. Okay, and so if you wanted things like a social life and a girlfriend, things which I certainly did want, then you needed to learn to drive because otherwise you were isolated and stuck. So it was really important that I passed my driving test first time. And I remember getting in the car and being really, 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 really stressed. And I said to the examiner, I need to pray, because that was how I'd like to deal with stress. I need to pray, so I prayed. She was a bit bemused, but was fine. And then we drove off. And I remember we did a few little turns and we were driving, and I could see her keep writing stuff on her little clipboard. And I was getting more and more worried, and I was like, I need to stop her from writing on the clipboard because this is going to be bad. And this is where stress overwhelms us, right? Rather than focusing on what I needed to do and just drive well, the stress made me think about other things that were unhelpful in the situation, like stop her writing on the clipboard. And so my response was to get her talking. I thought if I interact with her and get her talking, she won't be able to write stuff on the clipboard, right? Sensible. But because I was stressed, the question that I was going to ask came out as a shout, okay? And the first thing that came to my mind was, for some reason, do you have any children? Which I screamed at the examiner. And she was so surprised by this outburst that she stopped writing things on her clipboard, and we engaged in a very long discussion about her family. It also included tactics like when she told me to turn left, getting so stressed about it that I just pretended like I didn't hear her, because I assumed that they couldn't mark you down for being hard of hearing while you were driving. And these are, needless to say, I probably shouldn't be driving on the roads, but hey, I passed first time, and here we are. I drove to the church building this morning. But it's in this situation where stress got the better of me, okay? And rather than concentrating and doing what I needed to do, what was in front of me, I started reacting differently to the situation because I was reacting to the stress. And as Rob said, last week, stress can, if it's prolonged, lead to anxiety, and it's bad for our health, it's bad for our relationships, it's bad for loads of different parts of our lives. So we want to think about, okay, how do we not get rid of stress? Because that's impossible. Stress is natural. But how do we use stress and deal with stress well? It might not surprise you that I'm going to turn to the Bible for this. It'd be weird if we didn't use the Bible at church. And I'm going to be reading from John chapter 6. And I think this is a really interesting story. It's really important. It's the only miracle, bar the resurrection, recorded in every single gospel, which tells you that it is particularly important. And I think it's a really good example of how to deal with stress. And it's where the disciples are put under a test, not too dissimilar from my own. So I'll read it to you. John chapter 6, from verse 1. Sometime after this, Jesus crossed to the far shore of the Sea of Galilee, that is, the Sea of Tiberias. And a great crowd of people followed him because they saw the signs he had performed by healing the sick. Then Jesus went up on a mountainside and sat down with his disciples. The Jewish Passover festival was near. When Jesus looked up and saw a great crowd coming towards him, he said to Philip, "Where shall we buy bread for these people to eat?" He asked this only to test him, for he already had in mind what he was going to do. Philip answered him, "It would take more than half a year's wages to buy enough bread for each one to have a bite." Another of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, spoke up. "Here is a boy with 5 small barley loaves and 2 small fish, but how far will they go among so many?" Jesus said, "Have the people sit down." There was plenty of grass in that place, and they sat down. About 5,000 men were there. Jesus then took the loaves, gave thanks, and distributed to those who were seated as much as they wanted. He did the same with the fish. When they had all had enough to eat, he said to his disciples, "Gather the pieces that are left over. Let nothing be wasted." So they gathered them and filled 12 baskets with the pieces of the 5 barley loaves left over by those who had eaten. After the people saw the sign Jesus performed, they began to say, "Surely this is the prophet who is to come into the world." Jesus, knowing that they intended to come and make him king by force, withdrew again to a mountain by himself. Okay, so this is the feeding of the 5,000, very, very famous story, miracle. Perhaps you encountered it in Sunday school, if you can remember that far back, for those that are watching. The whole miracle, and in the context of the chapter, demonstrates prophetically who Jesus is. Right? It's a parallel to the way that the Israelites were fed in the desert. This mass feeding, that Jesus is the true bread of life, and ultimately the true Messiah and King. And it was indeed a test for the disciples to see how they would react to this. Now, it's worth saying, not every situation where we encounter stress is a test from God. Okay? Not every time that we feel we're unable to cope with something, or we start to get worried about something, we shouldn't think, okay, God must be testing me here. That's not what I'm saying. But in every situation where we encounter stress, God is interested in where we're going to look first. Are we going to look to ourselves and to what we can do and provide by our own means, or are we going to keep seeking after him, keep seeking God's kingdom? And that's certainly what this parable is all about. Okay, it's about seeking the kingdom and seeing who Jesus really is, other than the crowd who wanted to, after seeing this miraculous sign, wanted to make him king by force. It's about realizing that it's a spiritual kingdom, and Jesus is a very different Messiah. But the account does, I think, give 4 helpful principles for how Jesus deals with stress. And it also shows us our own response to stress, mirrored in the disciples. Maybe you picked this up, but in chapter 7 in verse 7, Philip says, "It would take more than half a year's wages to buy enough bread for each one to have a bite." And often our own response to a stressful situation is, the problem is too big for me. And this is what the disciples demonstrate here. The problem is too big for me. Do you even understand the size of the problem I'm facing? It's too much for me to handle. And then in verse 9, Peter also demonstrates another one of our responses. Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, spoke up. Sorry, Andrew, not Peter. Andrew says, "Here is a boy with 5 small barley loaves and 2 small fish, but how far will they go among so many?" And the other response we often have is, to a stressful situation, "I don't have enough money," or "I don't have enough resources. This problem is too big and I'm not enough to cope with it." And often that is what makes us react poorly in a situation, because we react to our stress. Same with me in the driving test. Oh gosh, she's writing things on her clipboard. I'm going to fail. Just driving sensibly is not enough. I need to do something about this. Hence me screaming at my driving instructor. Slightly strange tactics. Let's look at Jesus quickly and look at 4 really practical things that Jesus does that can help us deal with stress. And if you remember but one thing, friends, if you remember but one thing from this little talk, remember this: put what you have got in the hands of Jesus. Okay, I'll say it a few times because it's really, really important. Put what you have got in the hands of Jesus. Okay, and this is the thing that the disciples do well in this situation. They stress, they worry, they think it's too big for us, but ultimately what they do is they go back to Jesus and they say, "Jesus, what are we supposed to do? How are we going to do this?" And they let Jesus do what he has intended to do. Because in the hands of Jesus, 5 loaves and 2 fish feed over 5,000 people. Only the men are recorded in the Bible. Sorry, ladies. The Bible was like that at the time. Then you just weren't as important. It's not fair. I'm sorry. But in the hands of Jesus, 5 loaves and 2 fish feed over 5,000 men with leftovers. All right, Jesus is showing off here. So let's think about what Jesus does. Let's go through the process of what Jesus does. The first thing that Jesus says is, have the people sit down. And this is our first principle, okay? When you encounter a problem that feels too big, you're not able to cope with, and you experience stress, break the problem down. That's principle number 1. Break the problem down. 5,000 plus people is a big crowd, okay? If they're all standing there and you're looking at them and you're told you've got to feed them, that's scary. If you sit them down, suddenly your perspective changes, all right? And often our issue in a stressful situation is that we've got the wrong perspective, okay? Rather than just concentrating on driving well, my perspective is I've got to distract the driving instructor, whereas actually I would have been better off focusing on driving well. Okay, so Jesus tells him, sit down, and his perspective changes. He can see the problem better because the problem's sat down and he's over the problem. It also means that people would have sat down in their family groups and in friendship groups. Thankfully, they wouldn't have had to sit 2 meters apart as we do. They could have sat nice and close together. So there's now the problem's broken down into smaller groups rather than one big mass of people. And it's easier to begin to deal with it. And that's a really good practical principle. When you feel stress and it's building in you because you're facing a difficult situation or a threatening situation, first thing to do is break the problem down. What's the next thing that Jesus does? Jesus prays. All right. It might sound simple. It might sound obvious, but Jesus prays. All right. He gives thanks for what he has got, and this is the thing we need to remember: to put what you have got in the hands of Jesus, rather than stressing about what we haven't got and the money you don't have and the resources that you need to conquer this problem. Okay, and running around trying to get desperately what you don't have. Look at what you do have. Look at what God has given you in that situation, and then put it in the hands of Jesus. That's exactly what Andrew does. He says, look, there's a boy here, he's got 5 loaves and 2 fish. I mean, it's not a lot, but Jesus, what are you going to do with this? And that's a really, really great principle, okay? Break the problem down, it changes our perspective. And once we've got a different perspective, we feel a little bit calmer, perhaps, more able to say, okay, Jesus, this is what I can do. This is what I have got. Help me. Make it more. Take it and do something amazing from it. And that turns a problem into an opportunity for God to work a miracle. Yeah? Putting what you have got in the hands of Jesus turns a problem and a stressful situation into an opportunity for God to work a miracle, because God is far bigger and much more well-resourced than any problem you'll ever face. Yeah? Our worries about us being small and the problem being huge and us not having enough, they're irrelevant problems to God, okay? God spoke the world and the universe into being. He spoke the base matter that makes up food and clothes and houses and money and all the things that we worry about. He spoke that into being, all right? He's not bothered about it. It's not a problem. What's harder for God, okay, is to find people with a willing and soft heart that are ready to put it back in the hands of God. And that's what we've got to do. Put what you have in the hands of Jesus. So Jesus prays, okay, that's the second step. But he doesn't pray and then like, bam, baps start falling out of the sky and fish just kind of jump out of the grass into people's laps. Oh, no. What does he do? He starts distributing the food to people. And in other Gospels, it suggests that Jesus gives the food back to the disciples and they start distributing it to other people. And what's amazing here is that Jesus works the miracle through his disciples, okay? The bread and the fish don't multiply in Jesus' hands. They multiply in the disciples' hands. As the disciples are giving it out, they're giving it out and it just doesn't stop. The bread just doesn't deplete, okay? And this is our third principle. Ask others for help, okay? Break the problem down, principle number 1. Principle number 2, pray. Put what you have got in the hands of Jesus. And then principle number 3, ask others to help, all right? I can't tell you how often I have been blessed through the different church communities that I've been part of, all right? Whether that's through financial help, lodgings and house help, people praying for me, people giving me food, that's always well appreciated. People sacrificing their own time and energy to contribute to my own ideas for different things. It says in Genesis, it's not good for man to be alone, all right? God didn't design us to do it on our own. He designed us to do it in community. And often miracles and blessings are worked through groups of people and through communities. And that's certainly true here. And one of the things that stress does is it tends to make us feel isolated. Even though we feel like the problem's too big for us, it stops us seeking others help from others for some reason. It makes us feel like, oh gosh, I've got to do this, but it's too much for me, and it kind of freezes us and isolates us in place. Ask others for help. Don't do it alone. Don't be too full of pride or worry or whatever it is. I want to bless you. If you're facing a stressful situation, I want to help you. 1, because as a community, you've helped me before. Okay, but 2, because that's how God works. God works through community and family and through other people. So ask God for help first. Pray is the second principle, and then ask others for help. Don't walk alone. Okay, what's the last thing that Jesus does? So he's taken he's broken the problem down. Sorry, that's our first principle. He's taken what the disciples have got and he's prayed over it and he's asked God's blessing, and then he's put it back in the disciples' hands, and together, helping each other, they've worked this miracle. All right, but that's not the end of the story. Jesus then asks them to collect up all the leftovers, right? And this is our fourth principle. Take stock of what has happened and celebrate. It isn't just that Jesus is worried about excess waste and he knows that we're going to destroy the planet through poor waste management and carbon emissions. Jesus isn't just worried about that. What Jesus is asking the disciples to do is take a look at what has happened, okay? When each disciple on their own, they might have seen a miracle, but they perhaps aren't aware of the scale of the miracle because they're only dealing with their little parts of the problem, all right? But actually, taking up all the leftovers and coming back together, taking stock of what's happened, enables their faith to grow. It enables them to say, oh my gosh, look at what's happened. You can imagine a disciple sharing stories like, I kept giving out the fish and it just didn't stop. It was amazing. And then someone else was like, I couldn't even lift the basket. There was so much bread left over in it. And as they're sharing these stories, their faith is growing, and they're seeing the scale of God's provision, but also their capacity for dealing with stressful situations in the future is increasing, okay? Because they're sharing stories of success and support amongst each other, and they feel better able to face what's coming next, all right? So it's really, really important. After you're through a stressful situation, don't just think, oh, phew, that's over, praise the Lord, crack on. No. Stop and reflect on what happened and see where God was present. See where you, through help of community and through God's blessing, you were able to overcome the stress and get through it, and celebrate it. Yeah, it will increase your faith and it will increase your capacity to deal with stressful situations in the future. So, stress is not unnatural, but it can be bad, okay, because it can make us focus on how we're feeling and deal with a situation inappropriately. It clouds our judgment and stops us dealing well with a situation. The best thing we can do, as the disciples did then, when we feel stress, is turn to God, as Rob said last week. And these are the 4 practical principles, just to finish, just to sum up, that Jesus goes through. First, break the problem down. Then pray. Put what you have got in the hands of Jesus. Ask others to help, and then take stock and celebrate what's happened. And maybe, just maybe, if we can work through those practical principles, our perspective can change, perhaps on our current situation, perhaps on the lockdown, and maybe if you've lost your job and people are dying around you and in your family. I appreciate that for lots of people, it's a really terrible situation, and I can't even imagine the amount of stress that must be coming from that situation. I feel stress from the situation, and I've not lost my job, and I haven't lost people from my family, so I can only imagine what people might be feeling. But perhaps if we can work through these principles, our perspective can change, and we can deal with our stress, work through our stress, and rather than it just being a problem and something that creates anxiety in us, perhaps we might be able to see it as an opportunity for the Holy Spirit to work a miracle through us. Be blessed.